I'm your host, John Byrne, and this is our monthly catch-up with Sarah Beth Felix. Sarah Beth, as we know, runs her own consulting firm and also is the author of a weekly newsletter, Dirty Money Weekly, which is, last time I checked, close to 6,000 subscribers. It's free. It's definitely worth the time and effort. And so we really appreciate Sarah taking time each month to sort of go over the highlights, the lowlights, the big issues in AML and sanctions and financial crime for each month. So we're doing this, Sarah Beth, it's not quite the end of March, but we're closing in on that. And so I wanted to just open it up. What are some of the major things that have occurred this month that you want to highlight? Obviously, some of those are mentioned in your weekly, but I know you also have attended a couple of conferences. One of them was the AML Partnership Forum, which we'll talk about later. So obviously, that's an opportunity to get information from your peers and colleagues as well. So what are some of the things that jumped out at you in March?
Well, I went to a few conferences. FIBA was at a Tennessee and Mississippi Credit Union League conference. I was at the forum, and another one that's escaping me. But so about 4 this month already.
Wow.
And I would say, the biggest themes. One, banks are getting super creative. And I don't just mean big banks, which we heard at the forum, but even smaller banks are getting super creative in how they're trying to detect financial crime. And I would like to say that, like, kudos to them. And if you're not doing that, like if you haven't really, gone through some data and tried to find, bites of either drug trafficking or human trafficking or shell companies or all these little things that we know are a priority, that like now would be the time to do that because the pressure's off from a regulatory perspective, right? You're not having to spend half of your year prepping for a crazy safety and soundness review. So now is the time. So if I was kind of surprised. I mean, from smaller credit unions to some larger banks and all the ones in between, like if you're not in that pool where you're trying to get creative and find stuff that you've never reported on before, now is the time. So that would be the first one. The second one would be the emphasis on sanctions. I know that I've said for a long time that it's nuanced and layered and complex, and it's no longer just a name matching exercise. And I will say kind of the bright side, dark side of that is this last month, I have heard from more financial institutions. And they came up to me privately after, I was done speaking, and they were like, "Thank you for saying that because I keep forgetting that we have to go beyond the name matching." And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, don't say that out loud to me." So, if you're not, and this isn't to shame anyone, but if you're not looking at sanctions as a dynamic investigatory process in your financial institution, regardless of size, regardless of products and services and customer location, now is the time to start changing how you view sanctions. It is not going to get less complex over over the next several years. So those are probably the two biggest.
Yeah, and I would say about that, obviously, sanctions have always been a national security tool of sorts, and definitely not being political. But in this administration, there's been a shift between sanctions against Russia, lessening them in terms of the oil issue and the Iranian war. So you got to pay attention to what you've just said, but it's also a daily exercise, isn't it? Because of if you follow, which you should, what OFAC says on a regular basis, there's virtually some note that I see, at least in my feeds, every day requiring something to be done by the sanctions officer or by that department, right?
Yes, that's a great point. I think the last time I pulled the average, it was 4 updates a week. Every 7 days. So, that's pretty much every workday that we have for the most part, where there's a change being made, somebody taken off, some entity put on, some FAQ published, some general license that's been published, all the Venezuela stuff. I mean, we talked about that when I was down at FIBA. Very, very complex. And this is where I think AI can be leveraged, not necessarily in the decisioning process, but in the gathering of information. Like, you get a hit on somebody that has a Venezuelan visa. what do you do with that? And that's where AI, a properly trained AI source, can help you figure out, and it should prompt you questions like, what's the industry? What's the source of wealth? Is there any ties to Maduro? Any ties to the current government regime? Any ties to PDVSA? Like there's a whole bunch of layers to just Venezuela. And we're just talking about one, sanctions restrictions of Venezuela, not all of them. So I think that's where if you're kind of overwhelmed, AI is going to be your friend in this, but you always have to make sure because AI doesn't always get it right. But if you ask it proper questions, I think AI has the ability to help you kind of, digest tons of information, tons of complex information about sanctions.
I think that makes sense. Prior to recording, we talked briefly also about something I know you want to highlight, and that's the very recent by Treasury postings of several risk assessments: the proliferation finance risk assessment, the terrorist financing risk assessment, and the money laundering risk assessment. Timing was interesting, and I think intentional, because as we know, the FATF mutual evaluation of the U.S. is going on as we speak. There'll be a final report probably sometime in October, but the in-person meetings are happening now. So Treasury released those assessments, I think, right about the time that the evaluators were getting here. But leaving that aside, what were some of the things that jumped out at you in those risk assessments?
Yeah, so I think the drum that people constantly hear me beating is that the risk-based approach and a risk assessment means nothing if you haven't done the threats and vulnerabilities part of it, right? And I said this when I was down in South Florida this week. I did not come up with that threats plus vulnerabilities equals risk. That is a Treasury formula that they've used for years. And so that's something that we should take our marching orders from. And so that's, for me, that was present in all three of the risk assessments that they published. I know that there's a delicate balance between what the Treasury can say in these risk assessments because the FATF mutual evaluators are here looking. So they can't really, say something that's going to get them in trouble. So I finished their sentences for them. In my newsletter, I went through and I said, well, actually, the Treasury really meant to say XYZ. And I think part of that comes from, we aren't going to make meaningful change here in the US and our regulatory landscape if we don't actually tell the truth about how things are. We're telling partial truths. The Treasury, is trying to position themselves, I think, in the most beneficial light, which I think we all do that. So I'm not
Sure.
faulting them.
Right.
But the part that's confusing and the part that the mutual evaluators are going to have a hard time with is that we say we have, let's say, money service business laws.
Mm-hmm.
Right. We have MSB rules. But how much can somebody transact before those laws kick in? And that's what that question is, that it was never divulged in the risk assessment. It's never been divulged in the risk assessments, right? So there's little pockets of you didn't finish that sentence in the risk assessment. So that's where I think the Dirty Money Weekly newsletter two weeks ago, I went through and kind of I know that the Treasury knows this, but they forgot to finish the sentence here. So, but I think for all institutions in the U.S., that you have to at least get familiar with these risk assessments because they all apply to you, because it's our national FIU saying this is what's going on, and it's all run by money, and all that money is going through your financial institution. So, if you are in a bank and you've never looked at these, they're published every other year. If you've never looked at these, now is your time to start going through and trying to do a threat and vulnerability risk-based approach.
A quick aside, I did an interview that's going to be posted next week with the Charity and Security Network folks, and they're obviously very concerned about the de-risking of charities. They were very pleased, though, with the references in the terrorist financing risk assessment by Treasury that, I don't say went out of their way, but they restated that not every charity is high risk. And the language that you want to hear, it doesn't mean it's addressed all of the challenges, obviously, but I think beating the drum, as you used with the metaphor, on the issue regarding that there are some charities that are extremely legitimate. They have proper due diligence. So Treasury did make that clear in there. So, we'll see. It's going to all be about what you said at the very beginning of this conversation. How do the examiners handle oversight going forward on all these issues? But anyway, I just wanted to mention that there was definitely a positive there regarding that one issue, which is important to a good portion of our community.
And, I was happy to see that they called out the payment processor loophole again, right? Because everyone knows that's my hill I'm going to die on. I constantly talk about it. So, I think this is the third year that they've mentioned it, or the third time that they've mentioned it for the payment processor. But yeah, I did see that they did make it clear that non-governmental organizations, charities, that they aren't inherently higher risk. I saw that in the terrorist financing risk assessment.
I also noticed in your most recent weekly, you talked about the residential real estate rule. Let's get your take on what has happened in the past. Obviously, there was a case in Texas, and there was also activity by FinCEN. Tell us, where do we stand?
Well, according to the FinCEN site, it's no longer applicable, at least for right now. I've read the judge's opinion, and he made it sound like FinCEN has to prove open and shut case of a huge amount of dirty money happening in whatever industry in order for us to regulate them. And that, to me, is the biggest problem out of this. We will continue to have judges, regardless of political party, who see that, because they aren't looking at our regulatory our framework and comparing it to, I don't know, Australia, and saying, hey, look how they've designed their rules to say if your products or services do XYZ, then you are this and you have to comply with this. That's how we should have written our laws. But we have a massive lobbying industry, which I believe is part of the issue, because no other country in the world allows a legal form of, I won't say it. So it's very difficult. And so we will continue to have judges that will vacate different things from FinCEN, because in their mind, FinCEN has not proved that there's enough dirty money there to regulate. Well, we only know what we know. We don't all the GTOs that we've had forever, not forever, but for a very long time for title companies. There's been no enforcer over that. So while law enforcement thinks that they get good data from those GTOs that have to report residential real estate, there has been no oversight. In fact, it wasn't until last year that it was actually on the largest title company's front page. And we've had these GTOs for years. So, there's different aspects to this that I think should have been part of that judge's decision. But unfortunately, it's just kind of a symptom of a bigger issue. Our lawmakers and our judges don't understand all the holes that we have when we look across all the ways in which money, value, assets can be stored, changed, sent, received, exchanged, whatever the term is. No one's looking at it from a 30,000-foot level going, wow, we have a massive gap here and a massive gap here. They're just, kind of piecemealing what FinCEN is putting forward.
Well, I've been doing this a really long time, and when we, the proverbial we, the stakeholders, helped pass the Patriot Act in 2001, we said, as representatives of the banking industry, cover everybody that has a financial footprint. And investment advisors we wanted covered. We wanted real estate covered, because we understood, we knew that there are ways to move illicit funds through those entities. And it didn't happen in large part because of lobbying over time. Over various administrations. So I don't think it is that the policymakers don't know. It's the lobbyists that we know, and I was a lobbyist when I was at the bankers. So not all lobbying is inappropriate, but the lobbying of those industries enabled policymakers to make a decision not to add what they called a burden, but at the end of the day, the BSA was designed to address all of this. So you and I aren't saying anything new, and if you're an AML professional, you know this, right?
Yeah.
You don't want burdensome regulations just for burdensome regulations. You want infrastructure crafted that makes sense. That's why we want the AML infrastructure improved, and that's why we want people added, entities added. So
Yeah.
I agree with all that. But I think sometimes people will look and say, "Oh, you're just being negative." No, I mean, we're professionals. We understand this space.
Yeah.
And there's clear evidence that all these areas of value can be used illegally. I mean, we're not kidding anybody with that. But
Yeah.
anyway,
Well,
that's,
I
you know,
will I want to say that, like, I keep hearing this, we want to reduce burden, and I heard this a couple times over the conferences too. We want to
sure.
reduce burden. We want to reduce burden. I don't buy that for a split second. And the reason I don't buy it is because everyone's saying, well, we don't, well, we want relief for the banks. No, you don't. Because if you actually want relief for the banks, you would regulate the unregulated parties, which
Right.
are, way beyond any of our peer nations, all of these different industries. You would regulate all of these because, and particular to this judge's decision, he talked about how these mortgages are that they are underwritten by banks, and banks have eyeballs on them. You're adding more burden.
Right.
You are shifting that burden of unregulated industries to hyper-regulated banks and credit unions. That is not relieving the burden. That is giving more of a burden to an already burdened bank. And I don't understand that disconnect.
No, I agree with you. In the minutes we have left, the two things I want to ask you. One is you mentioned it's sort of a positive note in that an agency that's being still pretty aggressive, not in a negative sense, is FINRA. So I know you covered some things in FINRA. Some of our audience knows that that's a self-regulatory body. My son worked there years ago, so I understand FINRA. But in the AML space, talk a bit about what you said in the weekly, and then I want to close this down by asking you some things about the conferences you were at.
Yeah. Yeah. So FINRA is really the only one. Like, I keep trending all these consent orders. Really, nobody's put out a consent order other than FinCEN in the last couple months. Other than FINRA, they are really out front and leading with the importance of having a reasonably designed AML program. And that term just came up over and over and over: reasonable and reasonably. And I think that's a term that we all like to throw around, and nobody really defines it. FINRA does a good job because they say we want it reasonably designed, and then they give them these regulatory notice letters, right? And then they go back and refer to their own publications and say, well, you didn't do anything with our, regulatory notice 109 or 121 or whatever it is. And they go through and they cite it. And so if people are looking for, how do I build a reasonably designed AML program, that's a good start. If you have not, tied your program and the fruit of your program, and you are under FINRA or even under SEC. I mean,
Right.
like, the sins that happen now that the SEC is not catching will probably be caught in the next in the next presidency. So, you need to be able to, like, stand up and say, all right, well, SEC published this, FINRA published this, and it's tied to this part of my program, and this is what we do to satisfy that. And that's what kept coming up on all these FINRA write-ups. So
The chief regulatory operation officer at FINRA is a gentleman named Greg Rupert. And I know Greg used to be at the FBI, and I think he was at, Charles Schwab's. Solid, very sharp individual who's in a really good role. So I don't know how much he's involved in this. I assume a lot.
yeah,
But Greg's been there a couple of years, so I wanted to highlight that because I don't think, as you say, and I've said, FINRA doesn't get the sort of play that the other agencies do. At least in our world, it doesn't. I mean, it may in other spaces. So appreciate all this. Like you just said, you were at least 4 conferences in the past month. Our forum, you were kind enough to be on a panel with me on human trafficking, so that was a useful conversation we had with our co-panelists regarding where we are today. What other themes did you pick up in the in the past month. I'm sure you knew most of them, but maybe either surprised you or an area where you think, oh, maybe we need to focus there as well.
Well, I would say the amount of times I've heard it's not deregulation, it's a shifting of, priorities and things like that. I heard that throughout where all the different places I was at, and I think I tend to disagree with that sentiment, and I think, yes, they're not necessarily rolling back, the codified law, right? But they aren't necessarily shifting it. Like, if they are shifting it, they're shifting it completely outside of our financial crime world into material financial risks, right? It has nothing to do with our world. And so I think the whole deregulation focus that I heard from many regulators at several
Right.
conferences I was at, I know that they can't probably say how they really feel all the time, and that's understandable. But I feel like it gives attendees the wrong idea where they're like, "Oh, well, okay, so then they are really going to give me the once over on the safety and soundness." And I have yet to talk to any client of mine, community bank or credit union, who has actually had even a half of even like 50% of what their last exam was like. It's not even close
Mm.
for the ones that's happened over the last year. So I think, and that all means for me, don't drop your defenses. Just because they're going light now, just because they only asked for a copy of your audit and then they said, oh, well, everything's good to go. That doesn't mean you get to like stop doing what you need to do. So that was probably the other biggest theme that I heard. But I don't really know if I heard anything and I was like, huh, I did not know that.
Yeah, and you're not
It's just a
saying
terrible
that.
thing to say.
No, you're not saying that out of a sense of arrogance.
No, it just
I
yeah.
understand that. And then on your earlier point, yeah, our colleague Rick Small has said the same thing. Don't let your guard down. And that's where it's going to be difficult to persuade senior leaders in institutions that are not in compliance or not in risk, because they're going to read the same headlines and feel, oh, we can, I don't say let guards down, but perhaps resources can be directed at other places. And I think before you do that, you really need to have a conversation with your compliance, your operations, your investigators, because there are statutes of limitations. And obviously this administration is very tunnel focused on fraud. I mean,
Mhm.
I would argue
Yeah.
only certain kinds of fraud, but it's definitely there. So you're going to have that area bulked up. So that means really you have to continue to spend the money and do the training and all of that. So I think that's all pretty important.
Yes, yeah, I would agree. In fact, one of the panels I spoke on this last month was about fraud, about emerging payments fraud. And I think that is something that, a lot of people kind of see it as an operational decision. But I think, at least the regulators I've spoken to over the last month, one of the things that they've said repeatedly is if they see a sharp dive in SAR numbers, that will be a sign to them that they need to go do a better safety and soundness
Interesting.
exam.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good thing to watch for. And that goes to your point about making sure that you don't pull these resources, whether it's fraud or money laundering
Right.
SARS. They are looking at that high level number. And so, don't pull people and let them put it over on the, alphabet soup compliance, and then your SAR numbers tank because then you're going to get a knock and talk from your regulators.
Sure. No, I agree.
Yeah.
That's right. Sarah Beth, thank you so much. It's Dirty Money Weekly, which you can subscribe to and follow Sarah Beth on LinkedIn. You will not be disappointed. So stay safe, and we'll talk again next month.
Thank you.